Well, the public audio stream is now open, so you can start the meeting.
Okay. Thanks, Jeannie. Thank you, everyone, for being on. I'm Walt Rakowich, and I'd like to call this meeting to order. The first item in the agenda is to approve the minutes. Let me open this up to the committee. Are there any questions on the minutes themselves?
Walt, before we start, let me take a roll call.
Okay.
Rakowich?
Here.
Brown? Brown?
Here.
Cotner?
Here.
Dunn?
Yeah, I'm on.
Echo present.
Lord?
Here.
Schuyler?
Here.
And Masser?
Here. Great. Thank you, Jeannie. Again, let me call the meeting to order and ask for an approval of the minutes. Do I hear first of all, any questions on the minutes? Hearing none, do I hear a proposal to approve the minutes?
Keith Echo moving to approve.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. The second item on the agenda is the roles and responsibilities matrix, and I'm going to ask Dan Heiss to get that. Dan?
Thank you, Walt. Yes, as we always have, we have this matrix outlined, and obviously if you look to October, the main set of responsibilities is the review of the financial statements, which we'll be doing shortly. I do want to point out there are a few items on here that are checked as responsibilities, and they are mainly checked as in the event that there's a necessity to do that, such as receiving hotline activity, ERM update, red flags reporting. At this point, there's nothing to cover in this meeting, but again, we leave them on here as reminders to both staff as well as the committee members that in the event it is necessary, it's there as a placeholder to make sure we don't overlook anything in meeting the responsibilities of the committee. That's all.
Great. Okay, great. Any questions with regard to the roles and responsibilities that Dan's just covered? Okay. Hearing none, Joe, could you cover the audited financial statements, please?
Thanks, Walt. For those of you following along on Board Effect, the statements are on pages 71 through 116. I have a letter, kind of a summary letter on page 71 that talks about the details of the statements. I do want to point out before we start that on pages 82 and 83 is Deloitte's clean opinion. That's always the most important part of the audit. They have conducted the audit in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and they have rendered the opinion that that everything here reflects accurately our financial status as of June 30, 15, and for the years ended June 30, 15 and June 30, 14. So this was a clean audit. Anything else we talk about can be taken in that context. Just an overarching comment about the general financial health as is reflected here. The university's balance sheet reflected modest growth and a positive operating performance. I provided you several benchmark ratios in the middle of the first page of the memo there. And while we are off from last year's record highs on these three ratios that we track the financial health of the institution on, we are still at very healthy levels on all three of these ratios. And we do benchmark these against our peers, both in on the Moody's annual release of higher education financial medians. We track ourselves both against the AA2 group and the AA1 group. And not only do we far exceed the AA2 benchmarks on all these measures, we are also competitive and beyond with the AA1 benchmarks. And the university right now is actually rated AA2 and financially trends as a AA1. So again, I wanted to provide that context before we go into any specifics on the financials. With that in tow, unless there's questions right now, I'd just like to walk you through some of the major year-to-year fluctuations that can be noted in these statements. Just wanted to see if there were any questions on the setup or the context.
None here.
Okay, hearing none. The balance sheet reflects the university's assets, liabilities, and net assets. June 30, 15, and 14. You're on pages 84 and 85. The net assets of the university increased by $290 million this year. 221 million of that was in the unrestricted category, and that is largely defined by the positive operating performance that I mentioned, and I'll cover shortly here with the statement of activities. Starting with the balance sheet, assets grew by $609 million, or 5%. That was characterized by an investment growth of $383 million. Although I will say we are moving in the process. At June 30th, we were in the process of transferring the $205 million President's Strategic Initiative funds to the long-term investment pool. So cash actually declined by $170 million, but investments did grow during the year by $383 million. There was an $80 million increase in prepaid expenses and other assets. That's primarily attributable to the university's, the university funding Penn State Health's acquisition of the St. Joseph's Regional Health Network. That cash flowed June 30. That was $113 million, and that was in advance of the deal closing. So we needed to reflect that as a prepaid asset on the university's balance sheet because we provided the funding to Penn State Health. And the last thing I'll cover on the asset side, there was a $244 million net investment in plant increase. So that's our investment in our total property, plant, and equipment across all the campuses and subsidiaries increased by $244 million after depreciation. Most of the buildings that make up our investment this year are very similar to the ones that were at the top of the list last year, including South Halls, Henderson Building, Burroughs Building, the Intramural Building, and the Hub Robeson Center. Moving over to the liability section of the balance sheet, liabilities increased by $319 million, or 8% to $4.3 billion. It's driven by a $191 million increase in the accumulated post-retirement benefit obligation. I did want to state there was the primary and really the only driver in that was an industry change in the mortality tables related to our population. So Penn State was among anybody else that has this same liability for post-retirement health care was required to make new elections on the mortality table, and that is really what drove the entire increase of $191 million for the year. Additionally, accounts payable increased by $93 million this year. Accounts payable and other accrued expenses increased by $93 million. That was primarily due to some trades that were in process on the university's BlackRock portfolio that had not been settled at the balance sheet date, so we needed to book an $83 million payable, which really is what drove the balance up. And then finally, we issued $135 million, or we refunded $135 million of university debt this past year. We also issued another $75 million of new debt within the board provided borrowing authority. So net, we did very well on the refunding, had substantial debt service savings, and retired our 2005 was refunded. The $75 million new issuance went to various projects on the capital plan that are underway, and the net increase between issuing the $75 million and saving and refunding the old 135 was a net increase to long-term debt of $40 million this past year. That was all I was going to cover on the balance sheet. If you'd like to move over to the statement of activities, which is pages, I'm reminded to stop for questions here on the balance sheet before I proceed.
Joe, I just wanted to clarify one thing. You mentioned that there was 230 or 225 million of net investment after depreciation. I think it's important to point out that depreciation was $295 million, so that the real gross investment in property, plant, and equipment was more like $500 and some odd million.
That is correct, Walt. You're correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so moving to the statement of activities, the university's overall operating margin was 7.4% for 2015. Operating revenue and other support rose by $145 million, or 3%, taking us to $5.3 billion on an annual basis. Medical center revenues were up by $125 million, and their net margin was $102 million for the year. The other major revenue increase was tuition and fees revenue of $91 million, or an increase of $91 million, which reflected a modest tuition rate increase, but also growth, particularly in the World Campus space. So that was a $91 million tuition growth. On the other end of the spectrum with revenue, operating gifts and pledges declined by about $61 million versus last year, and that was a result of the bringing the For the Future campaign to an end in 2014. So although there was a decline in gifts, that was expected as we are in this window between campaigns right now. The operating expenses overall increased by $323 million, or 7% during 2015. Again, the medical center was the prime driver of that, $143 million increase in their expenses. Instructional expenses of the institution rose 7%, or by $86 million, and institutional support costs rose by $63 million, driven by legal and non-recurring settlement costs. Non-operating activities were last year. Non-operating activities provided a significant increase to net assets. This year, because of the net investment loss on the long-term portfolio, we lost about $27 million on the long-term portfolio due to market conditions. Contrast that with last year's record performance of $482 million return during 2014, and that's really the primary driver for the declines you see in the non-operating section of the statement of activities. I will also say that I mentioned the $192 million increase in our post-retirement benefit liability earlier. $101 million of that is reflected in the non-operating piece. The balance is reflected up above in operations. Again, I'll pause briefly there if there's questions on the statement of activities.
Questions by anybody? Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Finishing up the statements themselves with the statement of cash flows on page 88 of your material. The overall cash flow for the year was a net $170 million decrease in cash and cash equivalents. Most of that was absorbed in our investing activities. $886 million was absorbed of the cash flow, and that is offset by cash provided from operating activities of $542 million and financing activities of $174 million. Again, the one thing I would peg it to is we are in the midst of moving, or at June 30th, we were in the midst of moving the President's strategic reserve to $205 million, and that $170 million reflects about $120 million of that move. The only other numbers I would call out here, the only specific line items I would call out here, the largest items, the purchase of investments and the proceeds from sale of investments under the investing activities section are a reflection of our change in some managers in the non-endowed portfolio. You can see there's a significant drop-off in the both purchases and sales during the year, and that reflects the, I'll say, more passive approach to turnover that the current managers take, which was why those numbers are so down so greatly.
Joe, this is Walt. Just so I understand, the purchase of investments and the sale of investments, that could just be simply moving some money in the long-term portfolio from, one fund into another fund, or one stock into another stock. Am I right?
Correct. And not even just fund to fund, but even a particular investment may have matured and simply rolled over and been replaced by either the same investment or a complementary investment.
Okay, so you're just recording all of those flows in and out for these two line items. Okay.
Exactly. That was all I had on the statements themselves. The cash or the footnotes are largely unchanged from prior years. They certainly have updated balances for 2015 and the like, but the disclosures are very, very similar to past years. I'll stop momentarily on pages 96 and 97 of the material. Recent accounting pronouncements are listed there. I will tell you we are either in the process of adopting these or in conversation with the impact of the university. None of them are considered, I would say, earth-shattering or groundbreaking to the university. We are prepared to adopt these new accounting pronouncements going forward. Everything else, again, simply updating and rolling forward the balances for 2015. I'll just flip to the end here. The last few footnotes on pages 111 through 114 talk about the Milton S. Hershey Medical Center. I know the board is well aware that Penn State Health is being formed as we speak. While we are currently consolidating the Hershey Medical Center and all of the other entities that are in Penn State Health at this time, there is some, if things continue to evolve as expected, at some point Penn State Health and the Hershey Medical Center may no longer in the future be consolidated into these statements, but as we sit here today, the medical center is fully reflected here. Contingencies and commitments. We speak very specifically about litigation and contingencies back on page 113. Happy to take any questions on that, but basically we have accrued and or paid all of the appropriate items and have reviewed that with our auditors, have reviewed those items with our auditors.
Joe, I think that from my perspective, obviously, and everybody in the committee looks at the largest item here is just post-retirement benefits. Obviously, the liability is going up $190 million, and, you touched on it before. Can you just give us a little bit more color as to why such a large increase?
Yes, the $192 million increase is actually solely attributable to the university adopting a change in the mortality tables that are pushed down by actuaries. And again, this was an industry change, so Penn State was just one of many to adopt this change. If you look at all of the other factors that led to that $192 million change, except for that mortality table, the liability actually would have decreased by $130 million, except for that change in the mortality tables. I will tell you the benefits paid or the cash out the door for the healthcare, for the post-retirement healthcare liability on a pay-as-you-go basis was about $45 million this past year. Our claims experience was actually better than anticipated and actually resulted in a reduction of $140 million in the liability versus the actuaries' initial projections. And the interest costs and service costs related to the liability actually increased by about $115 million for the year. So basically, the benefits paid and the positive claims experience effectively offset the other major moving parts of the actuarial valuation of this liability. And the last one I would call out specifically, discount rate. We actually have to discount this for time value of money out into the future. And this year, because interest rates increased ever so slightly over last year, that actually resulted in a $96 million reduction of the liability. If interest rates continue to climb as we would expect in the future, that will actually continue to bring this liability down.
Right.
Was that what you were looking for, Walt?
Yeah, it is. It's really also, is it not increasing healthcare costs, or did that not really enter into it this year?
Trend rates are one factor. That was about $27 million. That was an increase to the liability of about $27 million based on trend rates.
Mm-hmm. Most of it was mortality tables, pushing it out.
Well,
okay.
Again, it was a $325 million increase due to the mortality table, but the net increase in total was only $192 million.
Right.
And again, I just want to remind everybody that this plan has been closed to university employees hired January 1, 2010 and beyond. So this is really the obligation for all the university employees that were hired before that date and are eligible at some date in the future to possibly receive this benefit. So that's all. The actuaries look at our population of employees and all these other factors that I just described and come up with the evaluation each year and provide us a full report on that evaluation.
Okay. Well, let me, Joe, is there anything else you want to go through on the financial statements before we just open it up for questions?
I did not have anything else in specific, no.
Okay. Well, that being the case, let me ask any of the members of the committee if they have any questions, any further questions with regard to the notes or the financial statements themselves.
This is Ted. I have a simple question. That for quite a while now, the Fed has not increased interest rates. Have we looked at if there was a significant jump in interest rates, what that would cost us overall?
Well, again, the interest rates actually move. It's a little counterintuitive, but because the factor here is discounting for the time value of money, if interest rates go up, this liability will actually go down.
Now, Joe, that's just, I'm talking about all the debt we have, the increase in interest on the overall picture. I understand your comment about the liability going down as the rates go up, but the amount of debt service we have would go up. So what's the overall impact of Penn State?
Yeah, so we only have one variable rate debt issuance out there right now, Ted, so it's a pretty modest part of the debt portfolio. It's about $74.2 million, and we're currently paying about 0.15 or 1.17 on the variable rate component. So certainly on a $74 million debt issue, there would be an impact, say, if it spiked to 1%.
Yeah, but that's $70,000. That's a rounding error. Okay, got the picture. Thank you.
Well, we've largely relied on fixed rate funding, fixed rate debt over the years for exactly the reason you're talking about.
I think it's fair to point out also that if interest rates were to rise, there would be a favorable impact on the returns on our investments in the short-term portfolio on the cash and cash equivalents, which right now is negligible.
Correct.
Good point. Thanks, Ted. Any other questions from any of the members? Okay. Hearing none, Joe, I think you need a formal approval on the financial statements from us. Am I correct?
I think Jeannie's here is ready to take a roll call vote if we're ready for that. If somebody, if we have a motion or not.
Do I hear a motion to approve the financial statements?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Jeannie, I'll let you do what you need to do.
Rakowicz,
Yes?
Brown,
Yes.
Hotner,
Yes.
Eckel,
Yes.
Lord,
Yes.
Schuyler,
Yes.
and Mosser.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Jeannie. Okay. The next item on the agenda is the Internal Audit Department Charter update. Dan, can I turn this over to you?
Yes, thanks, Walt. As required by our international internal auditing standards, the department, in order to maintain conformance with those standards, is required to have this charter approved every year by the committee and then signed off by the chair. And again, this is mainly to ensure that we maintain our audit and our objectivity and independence with respect to our function. There is really only one minor change that occurred, and that's highlighted. We did track changes for you. And basically, this reflects the operational change that we made you aware of at the last joint meeting back in September, where the hotline administration, which was originally done and performed by internal audit, we've been in the midst of transitioning that over to the Compliance and Ethics and Compliance Office. That is now complete. So while I am still involved with Reed and his office and working the hotline cases, they get all the intake to the cases, and we get assigned those cases, and if it's a financial nature, and that's what this reflects. Other than that, there were no any changes in the document, and I would welcome any questions and then ask for approval of this charter so we can maintain conformance with international internal auditing standards.
Thanks, Dan. Any questions that any of the committee members have on the change or the charter itself? Okay, hearing none, do I hear a motion to approve the charter?
So move.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Let's do a quick roll call vote since
Okay.
we're on the audio stream.
All right.
Rakowicz,
Yes.
Brown,
Yes.
Cotner,
Yes.
Eckel,
Yes.
Lord,
Yes.
Schuyler,
Yes.
and Mosser. Mosser?
Okay. Okay. Jamie, can I move on?
Yes.
Right. All right. Dan, the last item, internal audit 9/30/15 follow-up report. Can you address this? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Walt. And I provide this report because obviously we do these on a quarterly basis, and since it's not available when we meet in mid-September, I like to give this to you because I know members of the committee as well as the senior management follow this report closely and monitor how we are performing. How is somebody? How are we?
I think Keith Masser came back. Yeah, I'm back on now.
Performing with respect to follow-up. The last page of this report indicates that overall the percentage of open audit findings has decreased. Some of our older reports have gone away, and what I'd like to highlight on this is the cooperation that the department is receiving, not only from all the obviously the entities that have open audit findings, but in particular from senior management, both David and Nick, who have made this a priority and have stressed the importance to, whether it's the campuses, the colleges, or actual administrative operating units and that leadership, the importance of addressing these open audit findings. Some of the proactive steps we've taken in the last year or so, there is, in addition to the staff, my staff works closely with the operating level people that are in charge of trying to address these. I have gotten the regular communication now. Every quarter I send out a regular communication to whether it's the dean or the chancellor of the campus or an administrative head as to how many findings they have open and what the listing is and what their status is with respect to the action their staff are taking. And that's improved. That communication has helped to focus the attention of the leadership. And in addition, in an effort to try and address these from oldest to youngest, every quarter we take the top 5 and set those as a priority to try and get those off the list. And you know, I specifically call and interact with, whether it's again the chancellor or the dean, and let them know they are in the top 5 list, which is not a place none of them really want to be at. And we've taken that action, and that seems to have helped. So we've been a lot more proactive. And this is all in an effort to meet the goal that Nick and David set about 14 months ago now, of 15 months ago, that all audit findings will be addressed within an 18-month period. So it's been a progress, I think, a steady progress towards improvement, and we've seen the numbers reflect that. So any questions on the report itself?
You know, Dan, I do think you guys have made a lot of great progress, but we continue to see, you know, a lot of open audit issues in the Eberly College of Science. What's going on there?
Eberly had, for some background, many of our colleges have, you know, decentralized IT functions. And there is a continuum from those that are, I would say, more centralized, a little more controlled, to some of the colleges where they really resided out in the department level and let the departments really drive the IT function. Eberly was probably the greatest example of the most decentralized. We had been working with them very closely, and I'd be happy to report that after, I would say, several months of back and forth with they had to transition to the new dean, and with Dean Kavner, we recently came to resolution where he has put out a lot stronger guidance as to the centralization of their departments and the need to do that in light of some of the recent compromises that we had in liberal arts and engineering. And because of that the open findings were related to that, but it took he was in a transition and had to get a better understanding of the issues. And at this point, you know, he's put out the memo that recently went out about 4 weeks ago, and then we issued our follow-up report. So while the progress isn't reflected on there, the steps that have been taken recently within the last month, I'm very encouraged by that, and I think we'll hopefully see that number go down in the near future, Walt.
Okay, I think everybody in this committee would sure like to see that.
And I know I've worked closely with Nick and David on this one as well. They were aware of it, and I don't know if either of them have comments.
No, just that Nick may want to weigh in, but I think we're obviously very attentive to this and the need to reduce the number of issues in the College of Science.
David and Nick, when I first joined the board for the child was Earth and Mineral Sciences, and I know you delivered a strong message that the dean was going to have to come speak to the board if they didn't get their act together. And as I look at the numbers, what was 51 is now 3. Perhaps that's what the new Eberly dean needs to hear.
And
We'll let you guys decide that, but I think Ted's raising a very good point.
That was the message already delivered. I will tell you, in the back and forth with him, it was very clear that this is an item that the Audit and Risk Committee focuses on in terms of this report. And I think the reason he saw that and he was made aware of that, and I think that was part of the reason he became a lot more proactive and was willing to go forward. So I will remind him and let him know that we had discussion today on this, and that's, always a driving factor. And I appreciate the backing of the committee because it does help when we interact with the individual. So I think there's been...
This is Nick, if I could weigh in for a second. First, in response to his comment, I'd agree with what Dan said. I think the dean is clearly part of the solution and the way forward, and he's actually, since he's been on board, taken some important steps to help advance us in a very positive direction. Second, without going into the details, there have been some personnel changes and related issues that have taken place in the interim, which I think have been a bit of a challenge, but I think we're on a much better path now in terms of having the right people in place. And then third, one of the particular challenges with the Eberly colleges is the nature of the computing that is done there by the faculty and the need they have to really basically run all of their computational resources sort of on turbo, if you will, creates sort of a fundamental challenge. I think over time, as we transition to a new infrastructure for high-performance computing, which is in progress, it's about a 3-year transition, including moving a lot of the computational resources to the new data center. As this plays out, I think we will be able to not only continue to support the faculty in their work, but also bring a lot more control and oversight to these IT issues.
Okay.
Well, Earth and Mineral Sciences had a lot of reasons why they had 51 issues, and you folks were able to address those to get that number down. So I don't see any reason why together we can't get Everly's number down.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, some of them ultimately just take, the time involved in building a new data center, getting all of the equipment. There's just some of these things are on a good path, Ted. It's just there's time involved in these transitions because they are very, very large magnitude operations. So just a little bit of time needs to elapse as we work through them.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Okay. Anybody have any further questions with regard to the follow-up report? Okay. Hearing none, let me just open it up to the whole committee with regard to anything discussed. Before we adjourn, is there any other comments that anybody wants to make regarding any of the items that we've covered? All right. Hearing none, then what I'd like to do...
Walt, this is Joe. I just wanted to correct one number I threw out on the variable rate debt question that Ted answered. I think I gave last year's rate on that, which was 0.18. This year's, after we reissued on June 1st, is actually 0.29. So we're paying a whopping 0.29% now.
Okay.
I wanted to correct that for the record.
Still rounding error.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Folks, we do have a private session, executive session, and I'd still like everybody to stick around. But as it relates to the public session, I would hereby call this meeting adjourned.
And folks, if you could just stay on the line until I get confirmation that the audio stream has been disconnected.